Anarchism grew out of classical liberalism. Classical liberalism collapsed because it ran into capitalism. Capitalism is inconsistent with liberal ideas, classical liberal ideas. Capitalism is based on the principle that for most of your waking life, you should be a servant who follows a master. That's called having a job. Suppose you have a job in a factory or a McDonald's or wherever. Most of your waking life is spent following orders. And the orders are very strict. What you can wear, when you're allowed to go to the restroom, who you're allowed to talk to, what motions you have to make, and so on. If you're working in an Amazon warehouse, what path you have to go through to get the fastest way from here to there, and so on. So that's capitalism. It's based on the idea that there are masters and servants. You look back at labor history, US labor history, 19th century, when the industrial system was established, working people were bitterly opposed to it. It was an attack on their rights and their dignity to have to follow orders. Having a job was called wage slavery. This was such a common idea that it was a slogan of the Republican Party. The Republican Party then was nothing like what it is today. The Republican Party in Lincoln's day, one of its principles was that wage labor is intolerable. It's an intolerable attack on rights and freedom. People can be wage laborers only temporarily until they can regain their freedom somehow. That was a standard conception of American working people in the 19th century. Capitalism had to be imposed by force. And in fact, if you look back at US history, the United States has a very violent labor history, much more so than other comparable countries. Until the late 1930s, workers were being murdered by security forces in labor actions. It didn't happen anywhere else in the advanced countries, at least. We have a violent labor history, and in fact, the modern period since Reagan, one of the major goals of the government has been to destroy the labor movement in many different ways. What's called neoliberal globalization under Clinton, the way it was designed, was basically designed to undermine American labor. And this goes way back. So capitalism was inconsistent with liberal ideas, liberal humane conceptions. Working people hated it. Finally, they've come to accept it, but I think opposition is right below the surface. Well, what's anarchism? Anarchism says, let's take the traditional ideas that authority, hierarchy, domination are illegitimate and have a burden of proof. They have to prove their legitimacy, show that we're legitimate. Well, sometimes you can do that. Like if I'm walking down the street with my grandchild and the kid runs into the street and I grab his arm and pull him back, that's authority. But I think you can give an argument for it. But any kind of dominance or authority, whether it's in the family, whether it's patriarchal family, parents and children, schools, social systems, economic structures and so on, political systems, unless authority can be justified, it should be eliminated. And it can very rarely be justified when you think it through, any more than employment can. Well, anarchism just says, when you find illegitimate authority, let's dismantle it and move towards a more free, just social arrangement. My own feeling is that almost everybody's an anarchist. when they think about it, when they think about the kinds of structures of authority and domination that they accept, and ask, should we accept them? Is there a justification for them? There very rarely is. You can think that through for yourself. What kinds of authority, domination, and hierarchy are legitimate? And if they're not, you should be doing something to work to get rid of them. That's basically anarchism.
Touching into something you mentioned at the end there, could you give some examples of legitimized authority or like just authority?
I suppose let's take indigenous American society. If there was a conflict between two tribes, which turned into a war, a tribe would pick a leader to determine how the fighting should proceed during the war. But they'd be picked. And then when it's over, they have no more authority. But during the period of the war, you could say that's legitimate authority, I think. You could argue about it, but I think so. And there are other cases of legitimate authority. So suppose you had a democratic society. Our society is very limited democracy, but a true democratic society in which decisions about the nature of what's happening are made by the public in public deliberation, public thought, and then you pick somebody to administer your decisions. Well, submitting to the authority of the administrator may make some sense, may be legitimate, as long as they're under popular control. There are other structures which I think can be regarded as legitimate. So class, like say your classes in school, there's a hierarchical relation, but I think it's legitimate as long as the educational authorities themselves are basically picked by a democratic public and kept when they're performing the tasks that they were chosen for. Then you can say, well, under these circumstances, I'll accept the position of authority. It's useful. That's teacher knows things I want to learn, so fine, I'll go along with it. So I think you can find plenty of structures in society that are legitimate, but most of them aren't. A lot of the ones we take for granted, like having a job, I agree with the 19th century Republican Party. That seems to me illegitimate.
So in a society like America's, right, where it's considered a capitalist structure, how do you suggest we move away from something like capitalism and into something like syndicalism or like anarchism, where we kind of think away from these governments?
Well, there are about 6,000 enterprises in the United States with value a couple $1 trillion, which are owned and run by the workforce. That's a step towards it. So instead of being somebody who follows the order of a master, you yourselves, the workforce themselves, runs the enterprise in a democratic fashion. It's not very much developed or cooperatives. Cooperatives work sort of the same way. People like a farming community can set up cooperatives for planting, marketing, and so on, where that's a step toward, all of these are steps towards democratic societies, societies where decisions that matter to people are made by the people themselves. We don't really have, our political system is not like that. And if you look at the way the political system works, it's basically run by concentrated private power. Take something as simple as medical care. In most countries of the world, medical care is just considered a right. You look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, healthcare is considered a right, like a right to food and so on. The United States is an outlier. We don't have universal medical care. Actually, we have it in a sense. We have the worst kind you can imagine. If you're injured or you're ill and you don't have enough money for the private system, you can go to the emergency room in the nearby hospital, and they'll take care of you if they can, maybe give you good care. That's our universal medical system. It's the cruelest, most expensive one that you can imagine. The cruelty is obvious. If you go to a ER in your local hospital, you'll probably see plenty of people there who basically need a nurse practitioner, but can't get to see a doctor because they can't afford it and don't have health insurance. So they sit around there for a couple of days until someone takes care of them. It's very expensive. US costs, health costs are about twice as high as comparable countries and have some of the worst outcomes. You look at infant mortality and other measures, we're down at the bottom. But that's because we're an unusually capitalist society. The population generally favors universal health care, but you can't get it through Congress because the people in Congress are basically paid by donors, and they don't want universal health care. They want private systems that make profit for the rich and powerful. And this is very strong in American society. So you take sometimes it's worse, sometimes it's better, but the last 40 years since Reagan have been unusually severe. There are even some measures of it. So one of the major research institutions, the Rand Corporation, quite conservative, part of basically quasi-governmental, recently did a study on how much money was, as they put it, transferred, I'd say robbed, but how much money was transferred from the lower 90% of the income the spectrum to the top 1% since Reagan. It's about $50 trillion basically stolen from the large majority of the population, put in the pockets of the super rich and the corporate structure. That's pretty effective highway robbery, $50 trillion out of your pockets. Well, that's the result of having a social and political system that's dominated by concentrated private power, which essentially, if you look at, there are very good studies of this. Turns out you can predict elections, electability with remarkable precision just by looking at campaign funding. And campaign funding mostly comes from the very rich, the corporate structure. There's good studies on this in mainstream political science. Turns out that if you look at these studies carefully, about 70% of the population in the United States is simply not represented in Congress, in the sense that there's almost no relation between the attitudes and desires of the voters and their own representatives. Virtually no correlation. As you move up the income scale, you get closer relations. When you get to the very top, they're the ones who basically buy the representatives. That's an extreme distortion of political democracy. It's not that we have none. It's not a totalitarian state. You can have a lot of freedom, a lot of things you can do, but the United States is unusually moves in this capitalist direction. And you see that in a lot of things. Like, take something as simple as maternal leave, care for a mother after birth. Every society has paid maternal leave. Poor societies, Mexico, everybody. There's the only country that doesn't is the United States. No guaranteed maternal leave. I mean, somebody may have it by accident or by insurance, but you don't have it guaranteed. Aside from the United States and a couple of Pacific islands, everybody has it. Or take, say, a paid vacation. Americans work on average about a month more a year than comparable societies because they have paid vacation. We don't. Guaranteed, you may get it by accident. You know, maybe your employer grants it, but it's not required. Well, we're just kind of off the spectrum in that respect. And that's because of the unusual power of private capital, which is much more than in most other comparable societies. It's not always been like this. Like during the New Deal period, when I was growing up, there were changes in the opposite direction. And they lasted through the early post-war period. But when you get to Reagan and since, they're gone, declined seriously. So there are variations, but the basic structure of the society has what I would regard, you can make your own judgments, as illegitimate structures of authority and domination. But, you know, think it through yourself and think what you... But it's interesting that a lot of what the public wants, they just can't get because it can't get through the Congress and executive, which is largely dominated by private capital, like universal health care, for example.